Now, the festive season may not be so jolly for many after all. The holiday blues are a real ailment, and for people who have suffered loss and trauma, the Christmas holiday in particular can trigger what is more commonly known as seasonal depression, and this being exacerbated by 2 years of a global health pandemic. So how can people deal with the holiday blues? Joining us to discuss this and more is a clinical psychologist, Dr Benedict Mhlongo. Dr Mhlongo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Perhaps let's start with unpacking what the holiday blues is exactly, because it's not an official clinical diagnosis. However, the season, as we know, can be full of potential triggers for some people. So when we talk about holiday blues, what are we referring to exactly?
You're quite spot on in the sense that it doesn't actually has a clinical presentation in terms of it being a disorder. But how we actually see that, we see it as a symptomology of a more of your severe or mood disorder, typically your depression. So holiday blues are more commonly actually seen or expressed by people who are actually very highly fatigued, burnout, as well as people who are very nostalgic around certain areas in their lives where they're actually seeing certain gaps or things that they're actually missing in life. So those are actually defined as holiday blues as well.
Yeah. I mean, I thank you so much for just clarifying that it is certainly an extreme version of some sort of mood disorder. But in cases where you do, in fact, have a clinical diagnosis and you are treating whatever mental health challenge you may be dealing with, is it possible for your condition to actually worsen during the holidays or to get worse? I think the misconception is that everybody is jolly during this time, but if you already have an underlying mental health problem, this may actually be exacerbated by the holidays.
Yes, definitely. It can in a sense that, because, I mean, holidays is a time for people who actually, predominantly need to be jolly, they're excited, especially around the festive season as well. But for a person who's actually suffering or person who's actually experiencing a more clinical symptom of actually holiday blues or feeling very weak or down, as an accumulation of them actually sensing certain things that are actually, an essential of certain things in their lives. Could be a loss, could be anything that is relating to particular loss, as well as trauma. So trauma has this thing where people then they tend to avoid their flashbacks. They actually have certain elements of them feeling very detached to what is happening currently in life. You find people are very happy and jolly, but they're very much more isolated, and they must, in a sense, to say, listen, I want to rest. Whereas they're just isolating themselves as well.
That's very interesting, that juxtaposition that you can actually find yourself in the company of people and yet still feel isolated and still feel alone. I think sometimes we underestimate, Dr. Mhlongo, the role that social media plays in our lives, especially the more negative effects that social media can have. You talk about people who've experienced loss and suffering and the absentia that creates. Sometimes when you are on social media and you're watching other people share their lives, it reminds you of what you don't have. Should we be a little bit more careful or a little bit more concerned with how much time or how much social media we're consuming during this period, especially if you know that you are prone to seasonal depression?
It's a very tough one, and I'm glad that you're mentioning that, because, I mean, how much we consume in terms of social media is also very attributed to us conforming in a sense that we want to actually be in the loop in terms of actually what's happening in the world. So it can become a challenge to actually try and actually limit that, but which also exacerbate a sense of actually us wanting or actually feeling that element of actually an absentia that we speak of when we speak of seasonal depression. So it's very difficult, but we need to then minimize how or what we actually consume, as well as how much or how frequently as well. So social media does play a pivotal role in actually highlighting that, because there's memories that actually some of the social media platforms that they actually express to people around this time as well. So it's quite difficult. Very, very difficult. Even songs, listening to a particular song, that can also trigger a person to actually experience seasonal depression once more again during this time as well. Indeed. So definitely let's minimize what we consume in the social media.
Indeed, indeed. And I think a little later on we'll get into some of the tools and tips that you can perhaps give some of our viewers who may be experiencing something similar. But before that, there is another element that I would like for us to discuss. The Christmas holiday is generally known as a distinct time for family. But if you're spending Christmas alone, surely this can be a trigger too, for whatever reason. Perhaps you've lost family this week or the last 2 years because of COVID-19, or perhaps it was a loss that was suffered a while back. So can this be a trigger to the fact that this particular time is known as family time?
Yeah, that is the most high or most major or very, very clinical, symptom. Because, I mean, this is a time for family. Because can you imagine if you are now actually spending this season or spending this time, whereas you know exactly there was a particular loved one that we actually lost in the family. So it becomes very moody, like in the family. Everything is just so dull. Everybody's just feeling very, lethargic in the sense that this person is actually missing. So especially if it's still fresh, looking at the pandemic as well, we've lost so many people around, what has actually happened and how certain things have actually restructured. So definitely this time is a high or highly triggering time for people. Even people actually working in remote areas coming back to home, they're not exactly driving back or flying back, whichever modes of transportation that they're using. They're always reflecting closer to home. Because of that time when they actually, stepped down into a tent, they saw that actually this is real. We're now actually, burying this person. So all of those memories or those triggers are always going to be coming back as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I just thought about this, Dr. Mhlongo. Another family element when talking about the Christmas break is not all families, unfortunately, enjoy, tension-free, conflict-free zones. A lot of the times you do have families that that suffer from tension, that suffer from conflicts for whatever reasons. And, even in our top story, we're reporting on a family feud that has gone horribly wrong, resulting in 7 murders. How can one mitigate that in cases where when you're actually with family, it often means you're allowing yourself to enter an environment that has a lot of tension, that has a lot of conflict?
I think what's also important is that we actually need to go back and actually find, because I mean, family for us, it has different definitions or connotations to what we actually understand what family actually is. So it's actually pivotal in the sense of the foundational phrases in terms of how we actually are growing up and actually understanding the roles that we play in a family, because family is seen in a system. So that is the most major important system. But in that particular case, you find that maybe if we were to reflect back and go back, you find that there was a radial dysfunctionality within the foundation of this particular system. So it's important, especially even now, so having actually lost loved ones or having actually not actually, experienced that, it's important to teach this concept of family, the concept of togetherness, which is very much important.
Sort of reiterate that concept during this time, right? Now, earlier you talked about how during the festive season, or at least the tail end of the year, people start reflecting on the year that was, the things that they were able to do, or things that they weren't able to do, and they often get overwhelmed by feelings of failure and sometimes even inadequacy, and struggle to maybe cast their eyes forward to the new year and the opportunities that lie there. Some of them maybe ask themselves, what exactly have I done with my life this year? What's your advice for individuals who find themselves in that space during this time that is supposed to be about festivities, that is supposed to be about a celebration of life and family, but they find themselves rather reflecting on what they could have or should have done? More of a regrettable tone, yeah.
I think that's very most important, the fact that they're reflecting, even though it's actually quite negative and very dark. But it's important for us to actually understand in terms of actually building a level of contrast to say, I was here last year, this is where I am. But sometimes it can be very excessive in the sense that you find people again, seasonal depression. They're isolating, they're feeling very down, they're feeling very moody, lack of appetite, insomnia and stuff like that. But it's also important the fact that you are actually thinking of that. It means, number one, you are present, you have the full capacity of awareness to see that this is where you are. But also moving forward, that is also very important for you to tell yourself that, listen, maybe next year I'm going to try and work hard. But for me to get to next year, let me start now. What is it that I can change? Because sometimes people can either do certain things, which is also toxic positivity, where we actually say everything's going to be great, it's fine, we move on. But which is also very negative. But we can also do on the latter part is that, listen, we take cognizance of the fact that what has happened has actually happened in a way that it's actually leading us to where we are. So also bring that light. And sometimes we tend to focus on the negativity, on the lack, on the stages, on the absence of what is it that we don't have. But it's also important to also reflect and look on the positives. We tend to not actually reward ourselves. We are always hard on the individual. So it's important to reflect also on the positives.
Yes, we tend to be very self-deprecating, I think, sometimes in our thinking patterns. Now, you've already mentioned a list of symptoms or things that we should be looking out for. Perhaps give us a list of what we can identify as symptoms of the holiday blues or seasonal depression. You've mentioned fatigue, but surely there are more signs, telltale signs that can let you know that, maybe I need to reach out to someone in this instance.
Definitely. Definitely the fatigue, the burnout, the isolation, the weight loss, the insomnia, the lack of appetite, low motivation to actually, go and get Christmas things, the lack of motivation to actually spend time with the family or actually repeat certain things that we used to actually enjoy as a family. So the loss of interest in things previously, enjoyed is also another symptom definitely of seasonal depression. So if you find yourself that you're actually not doing the things that you were actually, that gave you joy, now you find yourself doing other things which actually feel like they're not. So definitely that needs a major, major, major one. So that is actually how we can actually see or actually try and spot on. And it can also be very severe in a sense that people can start, for instance, giving away their clothes, their prized possessions, which can also lead to another level of suicidality as well, which you need to actually look out for, especially this season as well.
Yes, yes. So, Dr. Mhlongo, what are some of the tools, the basic tools that you can share with our viewers on how best to tackle something like this, something that can often go unseen? It's almost as though it's an invisible disease. But surely once you have identified that you may be going through something, what are some of the tools that one can use to get themselves out of the funk they find themselves in?
No, very important. We also need to empower the viewers out there. Number one, we need to actually understand that, listen, this is where we are. We need to take a level of acceptance and a level of awareness to say that, listen, I've lost this, I've lost A, B, and C, and then it also led me to thinking like this. Number one, from the loss element where you're feeling a very, the seasonal depression around this time where you've lost a loved one, it's important to actually, because we live in a society or in a society that is actually very much driven around practices and cultural practices as well. So if it means you do your own, I don't want to call it a ritual or anything, but whether you actually, play a particular song that reminds you of this person, have their pictures put up, or, on the wall in the family, cook their favorite meals, play their favorite music with the family as well. That is very important because that actually allows for a healing process that is very healthy as well, because we are not avoiding and it's not actually hitting us in a way that we actually not actually waiting for it or being ready. So definitely in the festivities around December time, it always becomes a traumatic event where actually people are finding themselves actually this is not the same as last year because we've lost A, B, C, and D. But it's so important to acknowledge that loss and do the things that you feel like they bring you closer to this loss and acknowledging and accepting it as well. So those are the just few practices that people can actually try at home just to accept and deal with this particular, seasonal depression, particularly around the loss relating to COVID as well.
Absolutely. Not everything that's gone is lost, is it? Thank you so much, clinical psychologist Dr. Benedict Mhlongo, for your insights, of course, there. I think helping quite a number of our viewers who may be going through this seasonal depression.